So those were the most clicked. Next, some of the stories debated online today. One of the most discussed stories is the climate change conference taking place today in Bali. Al Gore, Oscar winner, Nobel Peace Prize winner and former Vice President of the US, has become the latest campaigner to blame Washington for the stalemate in agreeing a new climate change deal.
My own country, the United States, is principally responsible for obstructing progress here in Bali. We all know that.
So why is the US getting so much stick, and is it justified? Joining us from central London is Tim Jones, policy advisor for the World Development Movement. In Washington, Marlo Lewis is from the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Tim Jones, are the Americans the real bad guys here?
Well, yes, I mean, the US have been obstructing the commitment of targets by rich countries. They're not the only bad guys. Ultimately, we've not seen enough action from the UK either. But the US's obstinate refusal to commit to action is condemning millions of people around the world to death through climate change.
Marlo Lewis, is Gore right and Bush wrong?
Well, somebody has to be the adult in the room. And historically, that's been the United States. So we're acting in that historic tradition of insisting that public policy be based at least partly on reality and not just on fantasy.
We'll deal with that in a minute. The US delegation certainly doesn't seem to be too worried about reaching a deal. Let's hear from them.
We don't have to resolve all of these issues, these last items that I've mentioned to you here in Bali. What we need now is a solid Bali roadmap, one that sets the stage for robust, constructive, and groundbreaking negotiations in the months ahead.
Now, guys, our guest tonight, let me just read a bit of this blog to you. In true American spirit, Al Gore has blamed the United States as the main block to launching negotiations in Bali. Thank you, Al Gore, for putting your country first. And then he marks up, end the sarcasm. Tim Jones, is that fair comment?
No, well, what climate change will bring is devastation to millions of people around the world. And in order to stop devastation, we need to see rich countries committing to reduce emissions 40% in the next 15 years. And the US is just refusing to negotiate on this, which will hurt people dependent on glaciers for water supplies around the world, but will also hurt people in America, as we've seen with things like Hurricane Katrina.
Let me just turn to Marlo Lewis on this question of why you think the reaction of the rest of the world is childish and the American is adult.
Well, because we really do not know how to meet the world's energy needs without emissions. The energy system of the world is based on fossil fuels primarily, and it is childish to pretend that we can just decree that emissions will drop dramatically without that not also requiring that energy use drop dramatically. And yet we live in an energy-starved planet where about 1.6 billion people have never even flipped on a light switch. So I would just turn the tables. I would say that if we go down this road that most of the participants of Bali are suggesting, then we will be condemning millions of people to poverty, misery, premature death. I mean, we have to first figure out how to meet the world's energy needs affordably without emissions before we talk about imposing arbitrary restrictions on energy use. This may be fine for Al Gore to say, who has a carbon footprint the size of a crater on the moon, but for ordinary people, you know, any little increment in the cost of energy really hurts.
That is just...
Okay, one understands that, but Marlo Lewis, let me just press you on the point there. Do we have time to go down your route of figuring this out? Don't we need to act now?
No, if you try to act now, you will put in place a system that is economically ruinous and therefore politically unsafe. The only way that people convince other people that we have to act now is through completely fantastical projections like 20 feet of sea level rise, which is what Al Gore talks about. The UN climate panel talks about 7 inches to 23 inches. For perspective, we had a foot of sea level rise in the last century and a half. Is anybody really all that inconvenienced by that? I mean, we have to put things in perspective.
Tim?
The two arguments made there are just ridiculous. One, the US, an average US citizen emits 23 times more than an average Indian citizen. It is the richest people in the world who are causing climate change. No restrictions have to be made on poor people from getting energy. It's the vast consumption of the rich which needs to be cut. Now, the predictions of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change are that glaciers on which over 1 billion people in the world depend for water, 1/6 of the world's population, could retreat if we do not take this drastic action now. There are many ways to cut emissions, reducing the amount of energy we use, massive subsidies for renewable energy, and maybe ultimately cutting some of the consumption of the richest people in the world.
Okay, Tim Jones. Let me give Marlo Lewis the last 10 seconds of this discussion. Marlo?
Okay. China already produces more emissions than the United States. If the entire industrial world were to stop emitting completely, cold turkey, zero emissions, that the developing countries would still have to reduce their emissions by about half in order to reduce global emissions by 40% by 2050. So there is no way the developing countries escape this punitive, draconian, anti-development type policy.
We thank you very much indeed, and Tim Jones, we thank you too. Now, let's just briefly have a look at another story discussed heavily online today.